So, we're a few minutes early, but it is getting late in the semester. You notice in all of your classes there are fewer and fewer people coming? Yeah, that always happens. I don't know what it is. People are all of a sudden having to like grade all their papers or something, and I don't know. Or the weather's getting nicer, and I don't know. It's supposed to be windy tonight, though.
It's supposed to be rain tomorrow and Thursday.
I feel like we were supposed to get rain today and yesterday, and then it was beautiful yesterday.
It was real windy the night before, though.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I was surprised. I didn't lose any trees or anything as far as I could tell.
I'm surprised I didn't lose power. It was so windy at my house.
You lost power?
I'm surprised I didn't, because the last few times it's been super windy, I've lost power. So, hopefully it's any trees.
That's because Doc is out there holding the wires together. No. That's Back to the Future. Gigawatt. Well, our main concern today should be the beginning of what we call American pragmatism. But I did have a few things I wanted to double check on Nietzsche. You never finish with any of these folks, but there's some things that just seems absolutely essential. I don't recall talking about eternal recurrence. I have problems with that. I think I began a little bit by pointing out Madonna, the singer, thinks of herself as a Nietzschean. She says she's a Nietzschean, or at least in one interview she did. And part of what Nietzsche says is if you create for yourself a role, that's what gives you power, a sense of power in creating that, especially when you use that to dominate others. But if you've created a role and the others expect you to behave that way, then you've lost that edge, you've lost that ability to be dominant, and now they're dominating you. It's almost like the master-servant irony in Hegel, right? So if you've got an image and you go out on the stage and everyone's expecting you to be that way, they're in charge of you instead of you being the one leading things and dominating things. So what you've got to do for Nietzsche is constantly recreate. Be something new each time, so that no one knows what to expect. And Madonna certainly is a great example of that. She was constantly recreating herself. I haven't heard diddly from her though for at least a while now. Maybe she's old enough. She's about my age, so I think she probably has stepped out of the picture. I don't know. It's bound to come back in roaring with some new special, self. In any case, the trouble with eternal recurrence is that in some sense I feel like that's part of what eternal recurrence is that you have to constantly recreate yourself. On the other hand, it seems like I'm wrong, and that what most people believe Nietzsche was really talking about there was the idea that everything in time and space repeats itself. So that everything that you're doing right now, you've done an infinite number of times before and will continue doing an infinite number of times later. So if you've ever seen the movie what's the name of the movie? Groundhog Day. Thank you. We were talking about that just last time. But you're from
Yeah, Punxsutawney.
Punxsutawney. That's hard to say this early in the
I
morning.
know.
In any case, you know, that thesis of that movie was the day kept repeating, although it wasn't exactly the same. Every day he tried something new, tried to kill himself by driving off a cliff, or what, you know, didn't help. He always ended up with the alarm going off, and it was the same day all over again. Or who knows how often, you know. I got the impression that it could have been really an almost infinite number of times, you know, but there was nothing he could do to get out of it. But that's apparently what people think, that Nietzsche was suggesting, that everything you're doing, you do an infinite number of times, past and future. And the reason he brings that up is to emphasize how important it is that what you do with this moment is essential to how significant your meaningfulness in life is. Right? Make sure you're doing the absolute best thing you could possibly do. So that's how some people interpret it. It's supposed to like scare you into making sure you're doing your ultimate best each moment, and not being like, oh, the hell with it, I'll do it tomorrow. I don't know. Difficult to know. Nietzsche himself made fun of people who thought they could figure out what he was saying. You think you know what I'm trying to say? Well, how do you know I'm even saying what I really mean? You know, it's like he's just torturing you, you know, because, you know, well, perhaps he didn't want people to think that they could control it, what he thought. Who knows? The Dionysian versus Apollonian. Apollo is the god of reason. Dionysius is the god of the harvest. Bacchus is the, I guess, the Latin name for Dionysius. And you know, when the Greeks would celebrate that, it would be an orgy, a chaos. You know, everything go crazy. Spring kind of rodeo, maybe, you know, where everybody just has fun. Whereas Apollo is the god of reason. Remember, I apologize. Right? What's my reason for doing whatever it was I did? And he's definitely pro Dionysius as opposed to Apollo. It's you know, kind of an odd thing with him. I think I mentioned Schopenhauer, and it's kind of odd how Wagner worshipped Schopenhauer and actually dedicated the Ring Cycle, those 4 operas that he wrote, to Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer looked at it and took basically a red pen. Did they have red ink? I don't know if that's true, but in any case, he took a red pen and this is horrible, you know, hate this. The problem apparently for Schopenhauer was that Hegel tried to make the speech of the text of those operas Old German. It's kind of like the King James Version of the Bible is supposed to be Old English. Well, but it was actually invented for the Bible. It's not like people really spoke that way. Same thing, you know, with Wagner's operas. You know, no Germans ever, you know, really spoke the way he has them speak in the operas. And Schopenhauer hated all of that. Fortunately, Wagner died before that commentary from Schopenhauer came to Cosima was his wife's name at the time. He married a couple times. Basically stole the wives of other people he liked, his friends. Liked their wives better, you know. But Cosima Wagner was the one that got that response from Schopenhauer, and she was glad that Wagner had already died, because he would have been absolutely insulted and horrified to see what Schopenhauer thought of his work. Kind of a mixed relationship between them. And Nietzsche not only liked Schopenhauer, but he also admired Wagner, absolutely, and thought Wagner was the perfect example of the artist that he was trying to describe. This is the best life. But then he ended up going to one of the operas at the new theater that Wagner had built for it, and instead of being absolutely impressed, he came to conclude that Wagner was just playing to the audience, the wealthy audience. He was just submitting himself and doing what the audience wanted. So instead of Wagner being the one dominating the culture, he was being dominated by the culture. And so Nietzsche walked out, horrified. If you're interested in a great presentation of all of that, watch Bettany Hughes' presentation on Nietzsche that I played a little bit of. Maybe you already saw it. It was about an hour long BBC production, and she's there at the theater, and talking about how Nietzsche reacted to it and everything. That's kind of impressive. So lots of things going on with Nietzsche, etc. All right, but we move on to my notes. These are my crappy notes and my old webpage, on American pragmatism. And I've got this quote, the American outburst. During the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there was an outburst and flourishing of philosophic activity in America. The key figures drew upon a variety of European orientations, British empiricism, Kant, Hegel, but an important group emerged which included Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, John Dewey, and George Herbert Mead. There's others, of course. Although there were sharp differences in their intellectual backgrounds, philosophic temperaments, training, and interests, nevertheless, there were also sufficient family resemblances. That's an interesting phrase, family resemblances. It's actually going to come from Wittgenstein later, talking about how language works. How do we know these are all tables? There's family resemblances. That's his phrase. So that they, as well as others, began to think of themselves as constituting a distinctive philosophic movement. William James, a gifted stylist and an immensely popular lecturer, labeled the movement pragmatism and acknowledged Peirce as its founder. And sometimes it is said that pragmatism was born from James's misunderstanding of Peirce, which, that's interesting. Peirce was so outraged, not really, by James's popularization that he renamed his own doctrine pragmaticism, a name ugly enough to be safe from kidnappers. Sure, he was being funny, actually. They were really good friends. In fact, Peirce in his later life was such a drunkard, not able to work or anything, that it was thanks to James financially supporting him that he was able to live as he did. And then James died. I'm wondering, well, how did Peirce get any support after that? And then Peirce died, and I'm wondering, how did his wife get any support after that? I think her name was Juliet. She was French. I'll talk about that a little bit. But so, by the way, I also went to ChatGPT. And where did it go? There it is. So I went to ChatGPT. Because the quiz question I set for you is, what's the difference between pragmatism, American pragmatism, and British utilitarianism? And I mean, that's a quiz question I asked for you, and it gave me a great answer, by the way. But so first I asked it, well, the book that I took that quote from was The Metaphysical Club by Louis Menand, which came out in 2001, Pulitzer Prize winning book. By the way, it's not deadly philosophical in nature, it's much more of a narrative. So it's a good read, by the way. So, and it traces the development of American pragmatism. And it's, you know, it's interesting. It's not a typical philosophy book, right? And there's core themes, the central argument. Now this is interesting because I read the book and I don't remember it being, this is the core argument. To me, you know, the core argument was what did they all have in common? But this one points out that American pragmatism seemed to emerge as a response to the trauma and upheaval of the Civil War, which shattered confidence in fixed truths and ideologies. And the book emphasizes the cultural and historical context in which ideas developed, arguing that philosophy is shaped by real-world events and personal experiences, etc. And so here's one of the other ones, Oliver Wendell Holmes. It's one of the four in the book. Charles Sanders Peirce, William James. By the way, William James's brother Henry James was the author. You might be, he might have come across your desk at some point if you had to read some of his deadly novels. And just kill contemporary people can't read that stuff. They're like Russian novels. I had one of my Russian teachers at DLI, Gospoja Furman. I asked her what was her favorite American author, and she said, "Oh, Henry James." I thought, how Russian. How Russian. The detail in character development and so on. It's just, William James, psychologist, philosopher, James developed a more human-centered version of pragmatism. And John Dewey, who we'll talk about next class, along with Wittgenstein. But the Metaphysical Club is a club that they named their club that the people that came at Harvard into that club. By the way, we have a local club called the Metaphysical Club, which I'm a member of, but it's invitees only. So I can't just. You actually, you could talk with Joseph and I. That's open. But the meeting that we have Wednesdays between what we call the Metaphysical Club was not my club. It was started by someone else. It was all lawyers and professors from here, and they're all mostly retired, and most of them live somewhere else now, because when they retired, they moved. So we've got Mark Failer, who was the philosophy professor at APU, retired and moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, because he did his research and found that was the best place to buy a house. He moved there. Will Jacobs, who is our emeritus history professor from here, he lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is kind of interesting.
You guys just doing Zoom type thing?
We do a Zoom, conversation. Jack Hickel, I've mentioned him. He's part of the picture. Paul Brown lives in New York City. It's just a bunch of interesting folks. However, we called ourselves the Metaphysical Club years ago. It's not like a big part of it, but that's just neat that we have that. And this is, of course, the source of that. Style and approach of his book. So here's the quiz question. If you're curious what you don't have to agree with ChatGPT. Remember, this is AI, and AI is loaded with magnificent answers that are probably wrong. It's up to your interpretation. Right? So the core concern between utilitarianism, Bentham, John Stuart Mill, is primarily an ethical theory. I kind of argued that you know, if you think evolution has hit ethics, and so it's basically an ethical theory to try to determine what is morally right based on outcomes, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. By the way, the main criticism of utility is that since you're concerned about outcomes, it's perfectly ethical for you to do evil things if you think the result will be a good one. That's one of the critiques. You know, like, you know, you could do an experiment on 100 people and not tell them what you're doing, but what you learn from it will help you cure millions of people. So it's okay for you to do something evil to those 100 people. Yeah, yeah. Kant, by the way, on the other hand, argues that you're never allowed to do the evil thing, even if the outcomes are going to be bad. Remember my situation where, you know, what should you do when, you know, the woman is in the car and the ugly guys are beating up on the car, etc. You know, what do? You know, your intuition tells you you've got to get out of the car, but you know that's not going to be good. You know, so there's kind of the deontic view that you have to do your duty regardless of the outcome. So that's the contrast between Kantian ethics and utilitarian ethics. Is utility, you could do evil things if you think that the end result is going to be a good one. Kind of interesting. So utility, ethical theory for the most part. Pragmatism, on the other hand, is a theory of truth and knowledge, as well as a guide to action. It holds that ideas and beliefs are true if they work. That's the American thing. Does it work? You know, and by the way, it might not be coherent. So we might do different things in different situations. Well, this works in this situation. This works in this situation. Well, but it seems like you ought to always do this. No, you do this in this situation. You don't do the same thing just because, well, it's the same. No, you do what works. That's the practical nature of the American philosophy, essentially. So methods. This is all ChatGPT thought of this morning. Utilitarianism is quantitative, rationalistic, often tries to calculate outcome, you know, figure out scientifically what's going to be the best thing to do. You know, how much pleasure versus how much pain can we measure it? And that has confidence in science, confidence in reason that we can actually know and figure it out. Whereas American pragmatism, we know we're going to screw up. We know that 9 times out of 10 we're going to do the wrong thing. And it's anti-foundational. And, you know, when we get into that issue, that really contemporary issue that we have over fake truth. Whose truth are you listening to? Remember, we've got so many different models that we can play with. We know it's going to be hard to say this set of foundational truths are what we're basing our lives on. Well, we're ready to hop from one boat to another depending on what looks like it's going to work. So do you like that? Do you ever use that word yeshu? Am I saying it right? You avoid. We would say avoid, right? Absolutes, and sees knowledge as evolving through inquiry and adaptation. Truth is what proves itself over time in lived experience. Mostly, it changes. We'll especially get into that when we talk about John Dewey. So, utilitarianism assumes that we can know what's good or bad. That's the fall, right? You know, we ate the fruit, supposedly. I remember, though, my favorite was Mark Twain, you know, where Eve realizes, you know, she never actually took a bite out of the apple. She put it down because she got distracted by the pterodactyl that ran by, you know. So that's kind of explanatory because we don't know, darn it. Never did eat the fruit, you know. God was wrong and thinking that we did. We were so embarrassed, right? So that's the fall, in a sense, you know, one interpretation. If you're curious, by the way, Jordan Peterson has a book out called "We Who Wrestle with God," and that's hilarious the way he describes that whole, you know, because he psychologizes, you know, the Genesis, you know, what's women, you know, response to this, what's men's, you know, etc. He takes the Genesis story, which takes place in like 2 or 3 pages, and I'm on page 70 and I'm still on that 3rd page. So if you want a long expose psychologically of what's going on in that story, it's fascinating. Pragmatism suspicious of fixed metaphysical truths. Pragmatists argue that what counts as good or true is always context dependent. I've said this right